Okay, let's wrap this baby up with the second annex, which is a very nice one actually. Examples of indicator-based identification of policy priorities, which shows some data and some interesting results, as I mentioned before. This annex illustrates the options discussed in Toolbox A and shows how to use widely available indicators such as the World Bank the World Development Indicators to identify priorities for action to build adaptation and resilience. So you can go back and look at Toolbox A. Not all indicators are available for every country and every year, so the country level analysis has to adjust to data availability. But once this starts, then data gaps can be identified so that needed data are gathered along the way. So in the next evaluation of these indicator based identification of policy priorities, there is more data to cover the needed gaps or the gaps that shouldn't have been there. The figures in this annex highlight specific vulnerabilities for some countries. The gray dots represent the full set of countries for which the indicator is available. The countries that are identified by other colors are discussed in the text and used as illustrations for specific vulnerabilities or lack thereof. So let's look at A2.1. Is growth rapid, robust, and inclusive? This is a question you want to answer with some data so that the indicator-based identification is possible. Figures A2.1 and A2.2, which we'll look at in a minute, illustrate how simple benchmarking can inform an analysis of economic growth and its inclusiveness and impact on poverty headcount or poverty gap. In figure A2.1, Honduras in the yellow dot, as we will see, has a negative income growth, suggesting it cannot reduce poverty and population vulnerability without first improving its basic economic performance. Okay, so we talked about macro-fiscal issues and structural problems, and this is a poster child for such a situation. Mozambique, which will be in red dot, has an impressive aggregate income growth, but only a 2% growth rate of the bottom 40%, suggesting that growth is not at all inclusive, so population vulnerability could be reduced much faster. So it's the rich get richer and poor get poorer kind of syndrome, even though it's not clear from the figure that poor are getting poorer. In figure A2.2, we'll see Ethiopia in the red dot has grown its economy by 43% in 5 years, but has not reduced the poverty gap for 2 periods compared to the bottom and the top income earners. This suggests that poor people are not benefiting from aggregate growth and are more likely to remain highly vulnerable unless growth is made more inclusive. So these are not just words that growth has to be rapid, robust, and inclusive, that you can look at data and see how things are actually leaving some people behind and vulnerable to climate risks and climate shocks and so on. So here is A2.1, income growth of the bottom 40% versus the whole population. So all the countries with data are in the gray dots, and yellow dot here is Mozambique, and Honduras is down here in the red dot is Mozambique, and Honduras here is in the yellow dot. So you can see that the yellow dot here is in the annual, in terms of average annual income growth surveyed in terms of percentages, and the average annual real income growth of the bottom 40% surveyed in percentage shows that it's on the negative side of the so these numbers here are negative, so it's on the negative side, about maybe -1 in terms of percentage of average annual real income growth. So this is not good, right? So this indicates that average annual real income growth of the bottom 40% is negative, whereas the rest of the country is positive on this axis here. So that is a good example of how things can fail if proper attention is not paid to these indicators that were highlighted along the way. A2.2, so the figure A2.2 is here. Change in poverty gap versus change in per capita GDP for 2006 to 2015. So it's split into two periods. Change in GDP per capita from 2006 to 2010 compared to 2011 to 2015 in percentages versus GDP in poverty gap from 2006 to 2010 compared to 2011 to 2015 in percentages. Again, you can see that there are positive numbers on this side, negative numbers on this side, negative numbers. So there are many countries in this phase space, some in this phase space, and Ethiopia is out here, which shows a change in GDP per capita is positive, which is a good thing, over 40%, but it really moved the poverty gap compared to 2011-2015 period with respect to the previous period of 2006 to 2010. Okay, so A2.2, the vulnerability of farmers and food security here. Farmers' productivity, income, and access to inputs and improved seeds are critical aspects of climate change vulnerability in many poor and rural countries. Here, again, simple benchmarking exercises using the World Development Indicators can provide insight about the vulnerability of farmers. So we'll look at this in figure 2.3, which shows that Angola in the red dot has low agricultural productivity with only $1,700 of agricultural GDP per employed person in agriculture compared to national per capita GDP of $6,000. So the farmers are left behind here. That Angola is below other countries with similar per capita GDP suggests that there is potential to increase agricultural productivity, which would reduce farmers' vulnerability to disasters and the effects of climate change. And other indicators such as percentage of cropland with irrigation or fertilizers and improved seed use can offer similar indications of farmer vulnerability and help identify opportunities for action. These are excellent data. Obviously, that means other countries have to begin to collect, and these countries have to increase the granularity of such data in space and time, so you can bring the vulnerabilities to local scales, because all vulnerabilities tend to be at a very local scale. Country level measures or even district level or other aggregate averages may not have much meaning. But climate change impacts on agriculture do not only affect farmers. Food price increases can threaten food security, especially where people already spend a large share of their income on food, or consumers are not well connected to regional and world markets and depend on local production. So we'll see in figure 2.4, which shows how available indicators can help identify countries that are particularly vulnerable to spikes in food prices due to the large share of comestible in the average consumption basket. In El Salvador, for example, food and beverages represent more than 60% of the average consumption basket, suggesting a high vulnerability to changes in food prices. The higher a family has to spend on average for food and beverages, the worse off they are in terms of buffers for other things. Let me pause here for a second. I have to take care of something. Sorry about that. So I'm recording here in the evening and something came up. So we are talking again about families' vulnerabilities to food security, even if they are not farmers. So there is a farmer's vulnerability, and then there are vulnerabilities of the general public whose income comes from other sources. So the word comestible here, not very common, but it's basically an item of food. The adjective of that tends to be edible, so edible food, sugar, etc. And comestible is an item of food. Okay, so we looked at this here: change in poverty gap versus change change in per capita GDP. So you can see that it's very flat in the sense that the change in poverty gap from 2006 to 2010 compared to 2011 to 2015 has not changed for many countries and is in fact negative for many of the countries. And here is Ethiopia, which has changed its GDP per capita for the latter period to be over 40% in improvement, but it has not changed the poverty gap at all, which means it has left behind a lot of the people. So 2.3 and 2.4, this is arranged in a haphazard way. So let me go to 2.3. That's my fault. Agricultural GDP per employee. Oops, I screwed that up. Let me fix that a little. This is not supposed to be here, so this is going to go here. I'm doing this on the fly. Oops. Am I repeating that somewhere? 2.2, 2.2 we finished, 2.3 infrastructure we'll look at, 2.4. So figures are not arranged so brightly here. So let's put 2.3 here and 2.4 here. So there are figures and there are sections, so I'm just mixing them up here. Okay, so we looked at this one, and now let's look at this indicator here. We looked at this. So agricultural GDP per employee in 2017, again comparing GDP per capita for purchasing power parity pegged to 2011 international dollar. Gray dots are all countries, and the red dot here is Angola. So agricultural GDP per employee in agriculture is not at all increased compared to the GDP per capita. So here it remains just around $2,000 international pegged to 2011, but per capita GDP has gone at about 6,000 international dollars. So farmers are left behind here, which gives you a very clear indication of where the policy prescriptions have to go in terms of uplifting farmers and their income to keep up with the rest of the society. 2.4, which we talked about here, pointer gone missing. Share of food and beverages in the average consumption basket. So this is for non-farmer incomes, looking at red dot here. So share of food and beverages in average consumption basket in percentages versus GDP per capita again in 2017. You can see that as GDP increases, the share of food and beverages in average consumption basket should decrease, but that's not the case for El Salvador here. So even though the GDP is up here, the average expenditure of the income is over 60%, almost 65% for food and beverages, which is bad news in terms of having reserves for dealing with climate shocks and even responding to early warnings, even if they're issued very effectively and so on. Okay, so we looked at these. Now let's go and look at 2.3, infrastructure services. Existing infrastructure access indicators can help highlight population vulnerabilities, which we will look at 2.5, figure 2.5, which shows that Mongolia provides access to electricity and improved water to a lower proportion of its population than other countries at the same income level. Mongolia is not in the bottom panel because data on sanitation is lacking. So we'll look at electricity, water and sanitation, and we'll see some very interesting results how they can be disconnected from increase in per capita GDP. So you can have a higher income but still have problems with access to water and sanitation. This will be a driver of vulnerability. A lack of improved water and sanitation, for example, makes people more vulnerable to health impacts of climate change, such as higher frequency of waterborne diseases and diarrhea. And this is borne out very well by comparing enteric fever or typhoid data in Surat and Ahmedabad of the state of Gujarat in India, for example. Surat is a poorer country in terms of per capita GDP and slum areas. Ahmedabad is richer with fewer slum dwellers, and yet Ahmedabad has a much higher incidences of enteric fever over many years because Surat spent more of its tax revenues and other state revenues on improving sanitation, which may have been motivated by plague incident they had in 1994, which generated a lot of bad publicity, so they wisened up and did better. Even when there is access to infrastructure services, their quality and reliability is unequal worldwide. The frequency of disruptions is generally closely linked to the level of economic development. Using per capita GDP as a proxy, we will look in figure 2.6 that electricity and water outages in 137 countries indicate this, but even if you come down to a city level like Mumbai, you can probably find that outages in water and electricity are higher in slums and poor neighborhoods than in rich neighborhoods because income gradients are very high. Infrastructure disruptions cost households and firms in low and middle income countries from $391 to $647 billion a year. Although disruptions have a wide range of causes, including poor maintenance, mismanagement, and underfunding, case studies suggest that natural hazards cause 10 to 70% of all disruptions. Natural hazards are a big player in this, depending on sector and region. So you cannot ignore natural hazards. So your system has to be, risk informed from natural hazards point of view. So here is 2.5 common indicators of infrastructure access, electricity, water, and sanitation. So in each panel we have dots. So the red dots are all Mongolia in this case. So you can see GDP per capita has shown impressive growth over time. Per capita in 2017, so you're looking at different groups and you're looking at population with access to electricity. So it ramps up very quickly when you climb up the ladder of per capita GDP or wealth, and then it remains fairly saturated at 100%, even though there are few dots for some countries down here. So access in Mongolia to electricity is saturated at just under 90% for whatever reason, and that is not surprising in many ways because of remote places, people living in regions where electricity has not been wired in yet, and so on. But if you look at population with access to improved sources of water versus GDP, Mongolia is down here, which does very poorly in terms of, the per capita income is still in the same range, but water access is quite low. It's around 22% or so, and there are many countries where increased GDP, per capita GDP, doesn't correspond to population with access to improved sources of water. And this is similar also in terms of population with access to improved sanitation. As we said, Mongolia is not here because the sanitation data was not available. But again, per capita GDP increase does not correspond to access to higher fraction of population having improved sanitation, which directly translates to vulnerabilities in many things in terms of health and vulnerability to natural hazards. So you may have flood and end up with a lot of diseases. So you are hammered by floods, loss of life and property maybe, and then you are dealt with a blow on health in the following weeks and months. So looking at monthly electricity and water outages worldwide, both panels used the latest available survey data of 137 countries with none older than 2009. Panel A only shows countries with up to 30 outages a month and does not include the 8 countries with all but these are all with per capita below $9,000 that reported 30 to 95 outages per month. So number of electricity outages per month drops off nicely as per capita GDP goes up, and this is what I meant by saying even within a city you may have people with very varied per capita GDP, and they may still experience higher outages because they live in a poorer neighborhood and they are not as well protected as the neighborhoods with higher per capita GDP. And the number of water outages also drops, but you can see the scatter remains fairly high compared to here because water availability and sanitation are not so directly related to per capita GDP, which should indicate what the policy requirements are, policy strategies and focus need to be. Okay, so we looked at that. So now look at A2.4, financial inclusion and macro fiscal risks and socioeconomic resilience. I could have gone back and rearranged the slides to do it more smoothly, but now you have a little bit of excitement going back and forth, right? Sorry for that. Anyway, socioeconomic resilience is a population's ability to cope with and recover from shock and adapt to changes. Widely available data sets such as World Bank's Findex and Aspire provide data about financial inclusion or social protection coverage that can inform on a population's socioeconomic resilience, how quickly they recover after shocks. We will look at a figure which shows 3 indicators for financial inclusion, healthcare coverage, and social protection coverage. While Indonesia in red dot is level with its peers for social protection coverage and financial inclusion, it clearly lags on healthcare coverage. So why that has fallen off the radar of the decision makers is not clear, but this data exposes that vulnerability in the system. This and vulnerability of the people, because Indonesia is very heavily hammered by things like El Nino, the Indonesian dipole, and so on. This could therefore be an area of progress for building the population's resilience. We look at figures A2.1 and 2.7, all showing how using simple indicators can help countries identify their vulnerabilities to climate change and natural disasters, highlighting opportunities to build resilience through development and growth, which again have to be inclusive. More sophisticated analyses are possible in each dimension, of course. For example, a full analysis of social protection should go beyond coverage and consider a system's targeting, generosity in terms of payouts, and ability to respond to shocks. Okay, so we looked at this in priority area 3 before. So we looked at this in terms of electricity, water, and sanitation. We'll close out with 2.7, sample indicators for socioeconomic resilience, looking at financial inclusion, healthcare coverage, and social protection coverage in some sense. Population with 15 plus age with access to financial accounts in percentages, and GDP per capita for 2017 in purchasing power parity pegged to 2011 international dollars. You can see as GDP grows, the population with access to financial accounts generally goes up, but the scatter is quite large. But Indonesia is here with financial accounts are only about 50%, despite being on par with many of these countries in terms of per capita GDP, or even being above some of these. Okay, so all these are very clear indicators of how data and indicators built on reliable data can lead to better decisions or priorities on policy designs. Universal health coverage, again Indonesia, let me make sure I'm red dots always Indonesia. Yeah, universal health coverage, essential health services, GDP per capita. So here again Indonesia, many countries generally health coverage goes up, but it saturates at about 80%. This is true even for a country like US. Many times costs are overbearing even if the per capita GDP goes up. So the change here is not that impressive, going from about 30 to 40% to about 80%, whereas the scatter here keeps some still at 50%. And you can see Indonesia is on par in terms of per capita GDP again with many countries, but health coverage is not that impressive at 60% instead of being higher. This is again population covered in social protection and labor programs with GDP per capita. Indonesia is here again. So generally as GDP goes up, population covered in social protection and labor programs tends to go up, but you can see tremendous scatter because not every government prioritizes populations to be covered by social protection and labor programs. So policies, especially with increasing risks from climate change and tax revenues being vulnerable in some sectors to climate change, GDP of the country itself will be vulnerable, and GDP per capita will be vulnerable as well. So social protection and labor programs become very critical in that sense. So this is slightly longish, but it's a great section of this report from the World Bank that is a nice way to conclude. Of course, I'll have many podcasts from other books, as I said, based on what I find interesting in terms of climate adaptation. Okay.